Hello folks, welcome back. This is our next recorded lecture for HI 121, and it is called From the Hittites to the Celts, a short history of the war chariot in the ancient world. Now, the chariot is something that is an image that comes to mind when you think about the ancient world, and like all stereotypical images, I rather like talking about the reality behind them. Now, the war chariot is also spotted in a wide range of different ancient civilizations, but when it's adopted, how it's used, and how its role changes has a lot to do with changes in local context. So as this course is all about the global context, it seemed like a good topic for a comparative study. Now, we see the first things that we would describe as war chariots around the 3rd millennium BCE in Sumer. There is an artifact known as the Stele of Vultures, which shows the victory of the king over a neighbor, and the king is riding in a 4-wheeled battle chariot. This is probably about 500 years into the actual use of chariots. The early chariots, we think, were 2 or 4-wheeled, and they would have been pulled most likely by onagers, who were wild donkeys. Now, the wheels would have been made of solid wood sections held together by pegs, axles at either the front or the middle of the chariot. These are heavy vehicles, and they're not particularly stable when driven at speed. It was very difficult, most likely, to control the onagers. Some historians have suggested they must have been donkeys because onagers are technically undomesticated. But we're pretty much relying entirely on art for what little evidence we have for this period. Now, we believe that at this stage of their development, the chariots were used as a shock weapon, basically. So the charioteers would arm themselves with javelins and axes and drive into the enemy infantry, but they couldn't effectively pursue them. Now, the major evolutions to chariot warfare came with the use of the domesticated horse in the 2nd millennium BCE, and what's called bentwood construction. So this is where you have, for instance, wood strips manipulated into the shape that you desire. This allows for the construction of spoked wheels and much lighter chariot bodies. And if you put a bit on your horse, this allows for greater control of your team at a higher speed. So suddenly, the heavy, unstable vehicle has turned into a fast and maneuverable firing platform for archers. So certainly the golden age of chariot warfare is the Egyptian period. The Hyksos are often given the credit for introducing the chariot to Egypt. They certainly used the chariot, but they didn't at the outset of their rule. We see them and the Egyptians picking it up around the same time. So just the third source. So the Egyptian light chariot, the one we're familiar with, we have an image of one in the slide there, had more or less evolved completely by 1500 BCE. It was made of wood and leather, it was very light. The axle was moved to the back of the platform, which increased its speed. Each chariot had a driver, along with a man armed with a spear or a bow. But, chariot warfare is expensive, not just the chariots themselves, but breeding and training the horses, protecting the builders and repair corps, maintaining metalsmiths and armorers. A chariot army required an immense number of support staff. Only one of the great kingdoms could master it. Now, different scholars have different views on how the chariot was used. Was it a screen for massed infantry? Were they held in reserve and then deployed as a winning tactic? Did they sort of line up and ride at each other? And then, infantry would go in to finish off chariot crews whose vehicles had been immobilized? We don't know. We don't know even less about how the infantry was used. We simply don't have the sources. Now, Egyptian kings are often depicted as alone in their chariots, and this is meant to suggest their horsemanship is so incredible they didn't need a driver. They could fight and drive at the same time. Was this true? Well, it's interesting. There's a scene at Ramses III's mortuary temple that depicts him hunting from a chariot. He's got the reins tied around his waist and his leg thrown over the front of the chariot to give himself more support. That's an odd and very specific posture. So it's possible that elite-level driving skill may have been a reality, not just an ideal virtue. Okay, so the flip side of the Egyptian use of chariots is, of course, the Hittite use of chariots. One of our few actual sources for chariot warfare in this period is a manual written by a trainer, Kikuli, from about the mid-14th century BCE. He used chariots, and he didn't use chariots. He raised horses for chariot use. It's a very sort of direct and simple set of instructions on how to raise the best horses for this. He had no emotion or no personal opinions on the horses, just wanted to talk about what he felt needed to be done. He's obviously concerned for the horse's welfare above all. It's a very dedicated training regimen. It's basically interval training for horses. So basically, there would be different heats or intervals carried out at different gates. Horses would get light and heavier days. They're never exercised to exhaustion. They're never exercised to the point where they might actually tear a ligament or anything like that. All right, so what happens is that the chariots that we see amongst the Hittites are heavier. So the 3-man chariot, for instance, actually puts a third warrior in with the first two. And this gives them the advantage. The third warrior had probably previously been a runner, somebody who just kept up on foot to protect the chariot. Put the warrior in the chariot, and suddenly you have a lot more speed and flexibility. We call this repurposing the runner. Now, what we know is that the Hittites seem to have made use of the chariot earlier than the Egyptians by about a century. We don't have any actual examples of Hittite chariots. Unlike the Egyptians, they didn't tend to stick them in their tombs. But certainly Egypt and Hatti are the two great chariot powers in the Near East at the time, and that sets up a famous clash between the two of them. So this is the subject of the document that you're reading for Tuesday, the Battle of Kadesh. Ramses II had mounted a new military campaign in Syria and had accessed Amurru, which was a sort of border territory that both the Egyptians and the Hittites wanted. The Hittite king Muwatalli decided to reconquer the area, which provoked Ramses to attack him directly. So the Battle of Kadesh is one of the most famous military conflicts of antiquity. It's the first that we can reconstruct in any detail from supporting evidence. What actually happens, or seems to have happened, Ramses seems to have miscalculated or relied on bad intel, and he thinks that the Hittites are coming. The Hittites are much further away than they actually are. But when he advances on Kadesh, he discovers they're right there, with possibly up to 3,500 chariots. Now, Ramses, we are told, sends his sons away and sends his vizier off to fetch reinforcements. Muwatalli launches a surprise attack, destroys part of his forces, probably would have annihilated the Egyptians if a relief force hadn't arrived very quickly by sea. The two Egyptian forces caught the Hittites between them, were able to drive them off. Now, this is presented as a great victory in Egyptian propaganda. It's carved into temple walls, the scenes of critical moments from the battle. Ramses has both a prose and a poetic account of the battle composed. Now, he presents himself, especially in art, as having driven his chariot into the Hittite horde and basically turned the course of the battle single-handedly. What do you think of that? Just think about that for a second. He wins the whole battle by himself. Tells you a little bit about the self-esteem of your average Egyptian monarch, really. Now, the battle is the first time when we see the armies of great kings fight each other directly. But the Hittites broke the rules of war by not issuing a challenge, not attacking frontally. They didn't make the right type of communication with the enemy to get this sorted out. All right, what about Greek chariots? So we actually believe that the Mycenaeans kept a whole fleet of chariots sometime between 1600 and 1200 BCE. They would likely have been made of wood plated with bronze, but how useful would they have been in Greece? Greece is kind of hilly. They have plains, but not all battle's going to happen there. It's possible that they simply found it glamorous. In the Iliad, we see chariots bringing the heroes to and from the battle, but then they tend to dismount and fight on foot. Now, it is possible that the Mycenaeans attempted to use them as their neighbors did when the terrain allowed for it. And that is supported by the discovery of something we call the dendropanoply, which is a set of armor that appears to have been designed for chariot warriors. It's got bronze plates from the neck to the lower body. Some investigation of Mycenaean roads suggests that they were in fact built for wheeled vehicles. So chariots could have had a role in moving warriors and equipment through mountainous areas quickly. Certainly they're not, however, as highly evolved as chariots in other places. Now, after the end of the Mycenaean civilization and the so-called Greek Dark Age, the chariot was used only for sport. Chariot racing became a marquee event at the Olympic Games. It's an expensive sport, and drivers were employees as much as jockeys are today. Now, in general, it's interesting that the technology spread into areas where it was not well loved, but was fostered for reasons other than simple functionality. Okay, so what about Northern Europe? There is significant archaeological evidence for chariot use amongst the Celts. In the earliest Celtic period, we see four-wheeled examples in burials, but by the Latène period, which is kind of like the classic Celtic period, the Celtic chariot has evolved to a lighter, two-wheeled version. There are a lot of these chariot burials in Germany, Belgium, Champagne, from about 5000 BC onwards. Some of them may actually have been made out of wicker, which would keep them very, very light. Now, they appear around the same time in the iconographic record. We see chariots in Roman sources. Julius Caesar, for instance, was fascinated by how the Gauls used chariots. We know a little bit more about tactics at this point. Not a lot, but for instance, we know that they would charge initially, then the warriors would dismount, the characters would charioteer would move off to the sidelines, ready to move in if needed. All right, let's get through the rest of this. Chariots in the East, pretty much we think they came through the Andronovo people in the late 3rd, early 2nd millennia BCE. These early chariots were not very stable, so probably it was used only for prestige transport, maybe carrying the dead as well. Now, the horse as a cavalry mount was most important amongst the nomadic peoples of Asia, China's neighbors, so it had influence on them as a result. They weren't riders early on in their history. In the Shang and the Zhou periods, horses pulled chariots. They avoided cavalry because it made them look like nomads. So Sun Tzu's Art of War, for instance, mentions chariots but not riders. We do have evidence for early Shang chariots around 1200 BCE. They are hypothesized as a group that came from the steppes in traditional Chinese historiography, but there's no real evidence for that, and there's too much cultural continuity. Now, they adopted the chariot perhaps because it was prestige transport in the steppes. Shang chariots are very often status symbols. They are significant grave goods. Now, the Battle of Moyi, Shepherd's Wild, to translate that, is in 1045 BCE. The Zhou defeat a much larger Shang force with the chariot, which rapidly begins to become the dominant battlefield weapon. The rituals of Zhou talk about sort of a decimal system of organization, 5 by 5 by 5 by 5, for the new chariot army. It seems to have been more of an ideal, but it's impossible to say how close some groups might have come to obtaining it. Now, in this period, the hypothesis is that fights between chariots tended to be like one-on-one, almost like dogfights, going back and forth across the battlefield with the chariots like fighter jets. Warfare tended to be highly formalized. The Battle of Changpu is a good example of that. Sorry, the rituals of Zhu were a description of the decimal system. I think I missed that. Changpu was the first full description of a chariot battle where the armies fought in 3 wings. The chariots dragged tree branches to raise dust clouds. They attacked from the sides. By this point, it had become sort of an article of faith that the chariot needed to be kept separate from the battle. They're vulnerable to archers. It could cause great havoc for infantry if chariots started to go down in front of them. In a way, instead of like fighter jets now, they're being treated like modern-day bombers, which need to be kept out of harm's way as much as possible. Now, during the Warring States period, we see the decline of the chariot. The reason for this is that, there's no real formalistic battle strategy anymore. Deception becomes a legitimate tactic. The actual problem that may have started the decline of chariots is the rise of the crossbow. There is some evidence of trying to mount the crossbow on chariots. The Chinese were really reluctant to abandon it. Alright, so this demonstrates the importance of the status symbol. Speaking of status symbols, how about chariots in the East in India? Likely they came from Central Asian sources, just like the Chinese. We see them in use from 1500 to 170 BCE. Originally, the driver was also the warrior, but by 500 or so, there were 2 different people serving different functions. It's hard to fight and drive at the same time. Now, we have some evidence for how chariots were used. The Rig Veda talks about various ways to approach the order of battle and emphasizes their mobility as a gift from the gods. The Mahabharata talks about what it calls the thunder formation, so massing your troops with the strongest at the center like a needle. This is all mythological sources, however, so you have to ask yourselves, how much do we take this at face value? The limitations of chariots become clear in Indian history as well. The Battle of Jhelum during the Wars of Alexander, the Indian chariots were at a severe disadvantage because it rained and they got stuck in the mud. They became very easy prey for the Greek phalanx. Now, the Mauryas, who we'll talk about a few weeks down the line, did continue to use chariots in warfare before they stopped having both warfare and chariots. They were all, however, displaced by elephant cavalry by 170 BCE. Now, think about the benefits of riding something like an elephant in contrast to a chariot. That is not an option that most of the other societies we've looked at tonight had. So I think what we can take away from this is that developments in military strategy can be driven as much by social perception and fashion as much as it is by need. So the chariots had practical benefits, but also drawbacks. And the fact that they had religious and mythological and status connotations were a big draw despite these drawbacks. And sometimes it kept them in use even when it maybe shouldn't have. It wouldn't be the first time that people go for technology based on looks as well as, or perhaps in lieu of, functionality. After all, a lot of us do own iPhones. Okay, thanks guys. That's the end of this week's lectures, and I will see you all on Tuesday.